This week we're discussing all things Eldritch and Arcane. How do you represent spells in your game of D&D? Are they discrete, specific things, or can you get artistic with the way that you represent magic? All that and more coming up right now. Hello everybody and welcome to this week's very magical episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, your favourite Dungeons & Dragons podcast. I'm Ben Byrne here, as always, with Shawn Merwin, James Hake, Dael Kingsmill. Dael, if you had a favourite spell from 5th edition, what would it be?
I'm going to make a lot of enemies when I say this. My favourite spell in 5th edition is Counterspell. Absolutely okay. Counterspell. I mean, let me just say right up front that yes, in Magic the Gathering, I do run blue in my deck. Okay, I'm an Izzet gal, but no, I love the drama of Counterspell. Right, there's so much to it. There's all this sort of calculation. Is this the right spell to use it on? Will it work? There's the drama when you have to roll against a higher level spell that you want to counter. I love it. I love it so much.
I agree. I think that it's better than Dispel Magic, particularly as a dungeon master, because by the time you get to casting Dispel Magic, a lot of the time the damage of the spell is already kind of done. How many counterspells deep have you gone before? Because I've had a counterspell get counterspelled. Have you had a counterspell be counterspelled by a counterspell?
I don't think I've ever run for anyone who's taken counterspell.
Okay, fair enough.
It's just me. It's just me alone on my counterspell island.
Shawn Merwin, your favorite 5th edition spell?
Is it wrong if I name a spell I created?
No, not at all. In fact, it's awesome.
Okay. So for Acquisitions Incorporated, I created a spell called Gift of Gab.
Okay.
And what that spell does is it's a reaction to cast. And if you say something that you instantly regret, you can use your reaction to say something else. And creatures within 5 feet that you choose will forget that you said the first thing and hear you say the second thing.
That is legitimately amazing. It's kind of like a what level spell is it?
It's only a 2nd level spell.
Yeah.
So I've so many times in games had players who out of character would say something ridiculous to make the table laugh. And the question is always, did you really say that? And of course they say, no, what I said was, so I thought, let's make them use a spell slot to do that.
I don't know.
I've also seen it used in really creative ways. People trying to get a message to their friend, but not want anyone else in the room to know. So they position themselves where they can say it and then use that to make everyone else forget that they had said it.
Genius.
So it's a way of passing information. People have tried to use it to counter a suggestion spell. If somebody says something, the suggestion, they'll try to use it. That's not how it's supposed to be used, but I've seen DMs allow that. So it's kind of it's supposed to be funny and role play themed, but I've seen it used in ways that are pretty ingenious.
Yeah,
that's very cheeky.
It seems to me like a low level modify memory. It's like a quick sort of whippy, take back. You need to have a counter spell to that spell specifically. That's 3rd level or 2nd level that says no backsies, and that's the name of the spell.
The no backsies counter spell, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. James Hake, what is your favorite 5th edition spell?
I've thought long and hard about this, and I think it's got to be Find Familiar. There is such a deep love of pets and just kind of additions to the party that I've seen in every group I've ever run. Someone wants to have a fun little guy who's just around with them. My Eldritch Knight that I'm running right now has been slowly transferring all of her fighter levels into Battlesmith Artificer levels. And so she had this familiar that was a vulture named Carrion that would often, it'd use hawk statistics by whatever metric the spell needs. And so it would always kind of swirl around the battlefield and then swoop in and take the help action, and I would attack the guy. But she has been kind of taking the Fey spirit that spell gave physical form and imbuing it into her Steel Defender. And the Find Familiar spell has a ton of fun little creative mechanical options, but the flavorful options for it are endless, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I love, as a game master, darkness. There's I can't remember what the half orc's called, but there's not half orc. It's a full orc. It's from Volo's Guide to Monsters, and it has the ability to cast darkness, which I describe as it basically opening its mouth and just smog kind of pours out of its mouth and fills the space. And I've used it a couple times as like a boss monster for a low level party. So it's a group of goblins or whatever, and they're being led by this orc that can cast darkness. And it can see through the magical darkness, so it just creates these fantastically tense, almost horror-themed, encounters where this half-orc casts the darkness and then disappears inside of it, and the party can't see anything. They don't know where it is. They know at any moment one of them might get stabbed. And then there's that standoff of trying to lure it out of the spell's radius.
I love giving bad guys creepy familiars because everyone's so used to it being like, oh, this is like James said, a fun little guy. And everyone's like, oh, it's cute. And you're like, actually, let me make it creepy for a minute.
Mm-hmm. Well, this episode being a very magical, imbued episode because we're finally getting around to talking about Strixhaven curriculum of, somebody help me out here.
Chaos.
Thank
Chaos.
you. Thank you. And chaotic it is, which is the latest release from Wizards. I think it's coming out in the next 2 days from this recording or 3 days from this recording for us in Australia. At least that's what a quick scan of the retail chains told me. Do you guys already have it, Shawn and James? Or do you have access to it?
It comes out tomorrow for me.
Oh, okay. Still waiting for. All right, so we're not entirely behind the times because we don't have it, so we can't talk about the book in depth. But kind of similar to how we did with Fizzbands, I thought we could maybe pour over the table of contents, which was published a couple of weeks ago on EN World, and I was a little bit surprised at a couple of things. First of all, how few spells there are in this book. I actually thought it was a setting book, but it's not. It's an adventure book. Dael, what are you most looking forward to in this book?
I'm just really excited that it's got the mundane school life under a spotlight, right?
Yeah.
I'm such a sucker for like the teen young adult drama genre where there's all this dramatic stuff happening, but at the same time you still have to go to school and you still have a test on Friday. I love that. That's like, oh, it's my favorite thing. And so when I read that they were like, yeah, we want it to really be just that you are going to school and you are magic. Yes, I want to have to find a dress for the dance. I want that. I want that so much.
It does feel very, first of all, downtimey. Like it sounds like a really good adventure for parties that enjoy the downtime, the social interaction, more so than the going out and killing monsters and bringing back the loot. But it also, to me, I don't know whether this is just me being overly cynical, but when I looked at it, I was like, oh, so this is like Harry Potter, the D&D supplement.
Okay, and you're not wrong. You're not wrong. Like, obviously, we have to draw the comparison, magical school, blah, blah, blah. But is it not also, like, a bit like Sky High, a bit like, I mean, Community in a lot of ways, right? Like,
sure.
And I also think that there's, I mean, maybe this is just my perspective and I would love to hear from our US Americans on this, but to me, it registers as having quite an Americana edge to it, right? Like it doesn't feel like we're doing sort of, cottage core, what do they call that thing? Dark academia. It doesn't feel dark academia to me, right? It feels like you're going to college and you are magic. You know, it's a little bit American to me.
Well, this is such an interesting thing because I think you're right on the money here. There's a lot of like media, whether it's British Harry Potter style or like Japanese through anime, that focuses on young students, on high schoolers or around that age. There's a lot of high school drama. Strixhaven feels like a collegiate drama, which really leans into the sort of American college life. Even saying college life is a very American thing. I know over in Australia you'd call it university. But you know, the idea of hanging out on the quad with your friends and tossing a frisbee around, or you know, whatever the magical equivalent of that would be, going to your classes, being in your dorm. Dormitory life is just not a thing for the vast majority of all Americans until they hit college. And because Magic the Gathering is an American property made by Americans, that comes through really, really clearly for me.
Yeah,
and
I suppose
on D&D Beyond, there is a free adventure that is set in Strixhaven, and in the adventure you play baristas working at the college coffee house, and have to deal with all of the problems that come up because the manager is not there, and you have to clean out the machines that make the drinks, but there's magical things going on with them. So it's very much I don't know if you have work study over there, but many people go to college and they might not need some money, so they work at the college in the dining halls or at the bookstore.
I'm
and they call it work
so
study.
happy right now.
Yes.
It's the coffee shop AU. I love this.
Yeah, and so it's up on D&D Beyond right now, where we could go look at some of the things that they have in the book, even though we don't have access to the book.
It was the point where I saw on the table of contents there was a magic item that said like boundless cup of coffee or something like that. That made me think, okay, yeah, maybe this isn't like, teenagers, but this is college. And I think, Melbourne, where I'm situated, is the city of coffee. It has a reputation of, as in Australia. So I actually really like that adventure. I didn't know that's what it was about. So I should go check that out.
If we're talking about this British versus US vibe, right? The other thing is that when we talk about Hogwarts, we're talking about what is they call it something else in the UK, but from my perspective, a private school, a boarding school, right?
Boarding school, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's from when you're quite young. Like he starts at 11 and he goes to 17, right? That's very young. Like James was saying, very young. It's private boarding school, private tuition, that sort of a thing. Whereas Strixhaven to me is like there are rival schools, and it feels like you gotta stay true to your school, whatever that Beach Boys song is. It's so like we've got our mascot, we've got our team colors, let's go, right?
It does. I mean, I drew Harry Potter comparisons, but maybe you're right, and maybe this more like draws comparisons to fraternities. But there is the different colleges. I'm just looking at the table of contents now, trying to get the specific word, but the different colleges or the different sort of guilds that appear to be in Strixhaven that you choose what you want to be a part of, which actually reminded me of Fire Emblem as well. Has anybody played that and they choose
Fire
their
Emblem
house?
3 houses.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think there's 3 houses in this. It works.
Yeah. Well, there are several colleges here in Strixhaven: Lorehold College, Prismari, Quandrix, Silver Quill, and Witherbloom. And I truly wish I were a little bit more up on my Strixhaven lore. I feel like if I were a huge Magic the Gathering fan, we could really delve into all of these different colleges with great specificity.
Yeah, I'm sure they each represent a color in Magic.
Yes, 5 colleges, 5 colors. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah. I have a quick question that's like off topic, but I'm kind of curious if you know the answer, because I've been watching The Wheel of Time on Amazon, and I'm not a fan of the books yet. I'm kind of trying to think of taking Monty's advice from last week and reading more and reading the Wheel of Time books. But are the colors of the Aes Sedai in that the sort of witch colleges based on Magic the Gathering? Because it seemed like they're all color-coded. It seems like a massive potential crossover. Is Magic the Gathering based on Wheel of Time? Not at all? Just me? Okay, cool. I'll see myself out.
I don't know about Wheel of Time, but I have a hunch that Magic the Gathering is heavily inspired by a not Robert Jordan, that's the Wheel of Time guy.
Yeah.
That's his name. Roger Zelazny.
Right.
A Roger Zelazny series called The Chronicles of Amber, in which there are these powerful planeswalking individuals who kind of create realms out of whole cloth by imagining kind of different layers and shadows of the one true Earth. And they kind of instantaneously layer a new world into reality. And that's how they kind of flit through the planes. And it came out right around the time that I think, Richard Garfield would have been inspired by it. Anyway, Chronicles of Amber, good read from the 70s. A lot of fun, actually.
We need an Appendix N for Magic the Gathering.
Truly.
The one thing I was a bit surprised about with this book, when I said earlier I was surprised that there was sort of a lack of new spells for a Magic book, is the fact that there appears to be like a Volo's Guide to Monsters number of new stat blocks in this thing, which kind of surprised me. I'm curious to see whether they do the new format that we've been talking about, where the spells are built into the stat block rather than being kind of listed in the stat block for the GM to go and find.
Just watching Shawn wrestle with a cat.
I'm sorry,
I just watched a wrestling match with a cat.
I flipped back over to my camera and I just saw Shawn struggling with his camera. Was it a cat? I missed the cat.
There's a little tail flipping around. It was cute.
Sean's familiar.
That's my life.
In and out.
Yes.
Speaking of cats, there's a large number of monsters in this book, which I was a little bit surprised by.
Surprises me too, yeah.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious. I mean, I've seen one or two of them. I think one of them's a mage hunter, which when I went and clicked through, I don't know whether the page leaked or whether it was published by Wizards or published, but it was a mage hunter, and I was expecting kind of like an arcanist inquisitor, like this dude who wears a mask who hates mages, or a white cloak if you've been watching Wheel of Time as well. And no, it's this like creepy spider monster thing with like blue tendrils that kind of come off of it, and these tendrils sense magic, which seems like a really cool idea as these things kind of, scutter around and search for mages to, I assume, consume and consume their magic. We have no idea, obviously. We're literally just hypothesizing, but I want to ask, Dael, what is a relic sloth?
A relic sloth is the slowest relic. It's the slowest one. It dies when it tries to cross roads because it's so slow. That's a relic sloth. It's a very sad relic.
Great. Getting run over by all the cars at Strixhaven, all the uni professors.
All those cars, yeah.
Yeah, all the college professors, sorry. James Hake, what about a ruin grinder?
A ruin grinder? That sounds like the sandwich I had last week.
Cool.
For those of you who don't know, certain parts of our country call a submarine sandwich a grinder.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, no, I had...
There you go.
That flew over our heads.
I thought it was a comment about digestion.
That too.
Well, yeah, I think that's kind of the effect it has.
But surely, Shawn Merwin, you know exactly what a pest mascot is.
That was the cat that I just had to pull out of my wires earlier. Is
Great.
Really what that is.
Perfect. Some very fun named looking things in Strixhaven's Curriculum of Chaos, but of course we haven't seen the inside of the book, so we can't really talk much more about it. But something else that caught my eye this week was at the end of last month, start of this month, that Wizards of the Coast wanted everybody to rank spells in 5th edition on a scale of 1 to 6, from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. They seem to be perhaps collecting data for this 5.5e that we've talked about for 2024. But I just thought it would be fun to talk about some of our favorite spells and rank them here publicly, especially some of the more common spells and the less common spells. So just like at random, James Hake, Blade Ward. Where would you put Blade Ward? The cantrip.
That's the cantrip, right?
Yeah. Protects against
2
blades.
out of 10. 2 out of 10.
It's not very good, is it? But
it's
how?
Just like I just as soon take the dodge action. We already have a 1-action defensive option in 5e, and Blade Ward doesn't do enough interesting IMO to warrant itself.
But how would, and I'll engage you and Shawn sort of designer brains here, how would you make Blade Ward function? Like changing as little about the cantrip as possible, still has to be a cantrip. How would you make it function that it's useful and gets chosen, but isn't just an automatic bonus action every turn?
Okay, is it a bonus action?
No, it's not. It's a full action, but I feel that turning it into a bonus action is just a bit OP.
Okay, I have a choice, and it flies in the face of the somewhat streamlined design convention that 5e has. But here's what it is. It grants you immunity to 1 of bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage.
Okay. That's not bad, actually. That's not bad, because then you can get, like, you know what your opponents are wielding. You might get caught in a situation where you can't run away. He's got a sword, slashing damage. I'm immune to it.
And I think that makes it a really fun and interesting option for anyone who can quicken a spell in the way that a sorcerer or someone with the meta magic adept feat can. If you're a melee fighter and you've got enemies who only have big bludgeoning attacks or something you've identified, then you can, quicken a spell out of that and still get your full range of attacks in.
What about if you changed it to being, like, instead of blade, because it is like bludgeoning, piercing, slashing damage. What if you changed it to just be like magical ward? So it basically or is that just the dodge action again? Maybe that's just the dodge action again.
So wait, what would this new magical ward be?
So it just kind of gives you, like, because how does blade? I'm trying to think how it functions typically. Is it that it had like someone has disadvantage?
Do you want me to read it out to you?
Please do.
For our viewers' benefit.
Yeah, for them. Because I was just looking it up as well. Until the end of your next turn, you have resistance against bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage dealt by weapon attacks.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't think giving resistance to every type of magic would make it any better. But by comparison, well, maybe not directly to Blade Ward. What about Bless? Do we think Bless? I think that's pretty good. I think I would put that as satisfied, if not very satisfied.
Yeah, it is. Bless is like a 9 out of 10.
Yeah, it's a very nice spell that it helps multiple people, right? Players don't want to waste their actions, especially on defensive things. But a spell like Bless that gives you multiple people, multiple benefits is definitely worth it, even if the character that's casting the Bless isn't doing a lot of damage on their action that turn.
Do you know what I don't see a lot, though, is... Sorry, Dael, you look like you were going to say something.
I was just going to say, I like that it's a little tiny benefit, but you can give it to a bunch of people. Like, I like that trade-off. I feel like a lot of the time you get a more substantial thing that you can only target one ally with for buffs. But I like it when it's just like, all of you get a little something.
Do you know what I don't...
I think...
Sorry, go ahead, James. I keep cutting you guys off.
I think the only downside to Bless, because it's a really good spell, is that you, a human being, and your 3 friends have to remember to use it.
Yes.
Remember, you're blessed.
Right.
I always stack whatever my Bless or my Bardic Inspiration, I always put it on top of my D20 so I can't roll without remembering that it's there.
That's clever. That's clever. But people don't seem to use Bane as much, which does the inverse, doesn't it? It's like a D4 subtracted from like as many enemies as you can see equal to whatever. Is this because Bane's less satisfying to use because it's the GM rolling the dice in secret and not, well, maybe in secret, and not the players? Is that why Bane gets used less?
I was just going to say, I give it to bad guys, and then what you said afterwards really made that make sense.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
I've seen it used as much as Bless in games that I've run. Oh yeah.
It's interesting. It's interesting because we made some pre-gens for some brand new players to use, and we made a Warlock, and it was Pact of the Great Old One, and the whole idea was that this Warlock is like, we had the Haunted One background, so it was like, I have seen things, they were a Lovecraftian investigator at the end of a Lovecraft short story. But we gave them Toll the Dead as their cantrip and found that players were really dissatisfied with this pre-gen because Toll the Dead is a saving throw and not an attack roll. And we had to change it to Eldritch Blast and found that players enjoyed that a lot more because it wasn't as passive in engaging with the game, but much more active in engaging with the game.
Interesting.
Yeah, I just thought it was... so that's where my Bless Bane theory comes from.
I think there's one more strike against Bane, and I do defer to Shawn on this one because my evidence is much more anecdotal, I think, compared to his. You've seen a lot of Adventurers League play and stuff like that, really broad field. But when I think about Bane, just from a design perspective, in comparison to Bless, you put on your player characters who you kind of anticipate not dying, and so you get the full benefit of Bless for its entire duration unless your concentration is snapped. For Bane, the goal of Bane is to make the enemies easier to kill. And as you kill the enemies, one by one, the benefit of Bane dwindles.
One by one, the benefit dwindles.
So the weirdest shade, like... Oh, you thought magic is your ally? I was born to magic.
Really adopted the magic.
Best episode
We're getting
ever.
silly now. We're just getting silly.
Lightning bolt versus fireball. Does anybody take lightning bolt over fireball unless it's for the thematics of a storm sorcerer? Debate.
No.
I take it because I like it thematically, but it doesn't feel as fun as fireball.
Yeah, fireball's too good.
I think the thing about lightning bolt is that like it's not as mutually assured destruction as fireball is, which I think is actually a strike against it. Lightning bolt is it's harder to hit your enemies and it's harder to hit your allies. I think people are much more excited about just like saying, to hell with it, just destroying everything.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, last one of these: suggestion versus something like charm person. Because the thing I like about suggestion is I believe in the wording of the spell, they don't know that they've been suggested, or at least it doesn't say specifically at the end of the wording the victim knows that they've been suggested. But charm person and friends, the cantrip, say that the person knows that magic was used against them, which often sees those spells never used at the tables that I've played at, because players don't want the reprisal that comes after charm person. Discuss.
They're all problematic, or they're both problematic in various ways, as any mind control sort of spell is.
Sure.
Suggestion being a second level spell, with charm person is first.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I've always liked suggestion better, just for the having to be kind of witty about it and saying the exact right words to get the exact right effect that you want. Whereas charm person seems to be much broader and tends to linger on without any sort of end in sight except for the spell duration.
I
If that makes any sense.
Myself, charm person is just kind of boring.
Yeah.
It's also it's got this kind of vague in a bad way. I know that I'm always like, ooh, yay, vague, that's a good thing. But like vague in a bad way kind of flavor around it. You know, it just feels like someone goes, I don't know, I want to charm them somehow. And there's no like detail to it. Whereas suggestion, what a good name is that? Suggestion. You're just suggesting something. It's just a suggestion. You know, it's, I don't know. I feel like there's just a little bit more spice in the flavor of it. So I don't know, on my rating scale, the standard rating scale of 1 to 6.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd give suggestion like a 5.
That's pretty high. Although is 1 good on your scale? Is 1 the highest or is 6 the highest?
I'm just trying to use Wizards of the Coast scale. I don't understand it.
Okay.
I simply apply the numbers.
I think one of the problems with charm person is that it the main thing it seems to do is apply the charmed effect. But the charmed effect, all that really does outside of roleplay is the person or the creature cannot choose to attack you, which isn't really that helpful unless a combat is going to start. But if you're in a fight or the person is hostile towards you, they have advantage on the saving throw against being charmed. So it's kind of like, what is this spell for, and how is friends not just doing what it does basically in the same way?
This is an interesting case where I feel like the way people think the spell works can sometimes overrule the way the spell actually works. I played with a lot of people who are just like charm person, and I'm like, they don't really know what it does. So they know it sounds like it does.
But, it's vague.
Yeah. So here's the writer on charm person that I think is crucial to understand. Is that yes, the first thing it does is it applies the charmed condition, which is very narrow in scope. There's actually a lot of spells and abilities that say while you are charmed, something else happens. And for charm person, it's the charmed creature regards you as a friendly acquaintance. And so that gives the DM a lot of latitude to decide, okay, how would this person treat a friendly acquaintance? Which can make charm person I think, a pretty tricky spell to adjudicate, both from a DM's perspective, but also from the perspective of someone who wants to cast it. You can cast Charm Person and get just a wildly different reaction than what you were hoping for. Whereas with Suggestion or Command or something like that, you can kind of create almost a Rube Goldberg-esque strategy to get them to do exactly what you're hoping for.
Yes, yeah. My favorite suggestion story was when I had this whole dungeon set up, and it was overseen by a Minotaur, and the players had to get to the end of the dungeon to get a MacGuffin from the end of it, and the dungeon was a maze because it was a Minotaur, and the Minotaur shows up at the start and goes, ha ha ha, you'll never get through my maze, and one of the players goes, I suggest for him to go and get us the thing we need. And I was like, okay, he'll be back in 10 minutes. Off he goes. Comes back 5 minutes later. Here it is. Yep. I was very mad, but also very happy.
That's when you decide, oh, and the entire rest of the dungeon's occupants decided to come with him.
Yeah, exactly. They all come pouring out. It's like, why are you bringing this out of the dungeon?
That's how you genie that wish.
Yep.
Well, magic is like a fickle thing, right? And the more that I see magic represented in media, I was talking about Wheel of Time earlier, and as someone who's not a fan of the books, I have to admit I have a dissatisfaction with how magic is represented in the show, because it's very like, here are some wavy lines and I'm going to do some dancing, and the wavy lines are going to like hit a dude, or it's like a force field and arrows stop when they hit a force field. And I think that magic, generally gets used very much in a way that's just like blunt force instrument. It's like the Green Lantern problem of like, I can imagine anything in the world to fight you. I'm going to imagine my fist, but bigger. How, I guess, throwing it over to you first, Dael, how do you discuss and or represent magic in your games of D&D? Especially knowing that you have to, especially knowing that you have to kind of follow the rules or make it work and make sense with the rules of how spells are laid out in the 5th edition rulebook. Yeah.
I mean, because I'm right there with you. Once watching sort of the first Harry Potter movie with my sister, she said, yeah, but it doesn't feel magic. It's more like boopity boop, Home Alone with wizards. That's how she described it. And so that's how I describe sort of, I call it like zip zap boing magic. It's just like,
sure,
ta-da, like sparkles and things just happen, right? It's like zap, go. Right. Whereas I personally, the sort of description of magic that I love is the kind of stuff that comes from sort of Narnia. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I think, has some of my favorite magic description ever, because I like to describe it as sort of deep and pervasive. It's like, it's there. It's just a matter of not being able to access it or control it. Not fully, not truly, right? So like you get these glimpses of it when, Aslan breaks the stone table because he knows about the deep magic, or Jonathan Strange will harness the rain to make it look like there are ships in the harbor when there aren't. Things like this, where it's like this magic is always present, and it's I call it supernatural in the sense of it being the most natural thing, right? It's deep, it's there before society was constructed. But that does become a problem when the 5th edition magical mechanics are a little bit more zip zap boing magic, a little bit more boopity boop Home Alone with wizards. So the struggle of trying to find where those two things can fit together, and that's, the entirety of my Vegan evocative thing is trying to reconcile that with 5th edition. And one of the ways that I do it is just by saying that all the different magical classes that you can play, they can't fully access magic in the way that I'm talking about, right? Like wizards train for years and years and years, and they are able to recreate some modicum of the power of magic, but they're not accessing real magic. Sorcerers, they can access real magic, but they don't have the control, right? So playing around with that kind of thing where it's like the magic is there, it's all around you, but it's so much bigger than you are. I don't know.
This is the sort of thing that makes me really think about D&D's pulp roots, right? Because D&D magic is like strongly, highly codified, and it's there to create, generally speaking, a very high octane atmosphere. and almost a scientific atmosphere when you're a wizard planning their spells. It really runs cross purposes to actually making something that feels supernatural in the way you're talking about. And I think to a certain degree, you just kind of have to accept it as a weakness of the system, right? It would be so cool if you could build your own spells and, you had like a rain tag and an illusion tag and something like that. And you could create rain, making the image of ships in the harbor in that way. And you could just kind of plug tags together and then describe how it happens. I wonder if there are systems out there. I wonder if, say, like Ars Magica or something like that, that's really focused all around magic. A system that I haven't played but really want to does stuff like that.
Yeah, Grim Hollow has that feel for me of it's something that you can control, but you can also lose control of it very quickly. Hence the Arcanist Inquisition. And we have monsters in the Grimoire that are called Arcane Anomalies. And these are things that if a wizard doesn't clean up their room after they're done casting their spells, bad things can come out from these candles that they forgot to clean, or the ink on the floor, or the chalk that they drew their magic circles with. So it's this very ritualized, but also very chaotic power that you must have complete control over in order to harness right.
And I mean, there's interesting things like I think it's interesting that warlocks mechanically get a little bit closer to that kind of like, small glimpses of the true power of real magic. But mechanically, a lot of people really struggle with warlocks because they don't have access to a lot of tools in combat, like they're a spellcaster, but they're super, super limited in terms of their spells. It all comes down to their eldritch invocations. I'm trying to think, I know that Arcane Ugly has just finally sort of finished and wrapped up, and it's now available for purchase. And I'm trying to remember what the spellcasting system in that is, because it's something like what James was talking about with that idea of different tags. Like you can sort of be like, well, it's sort of a spell that is about fire, but also this other tag, and you stick them together, and it's all about the language that you use. But like Shawn was saying, when your spellcasting comes down to word choice, there's a danger in that. There's a danger that you will misspeak and that you will end up creating something with your magic that you can't like put back in the bag.
Yeah. I think the weakness with 5th edition, I used to describe it as being something that, because it's a rule system, because you need to be able to apply it in a game, the spells have very discrete descriptions of specifically what they do, because they need to be applied within a game setting and do the same thing every time, so that there's a scope of expectation among the players and the GM as to what this spell does. And that, inherently creates a very unmagical feel, because the spells do the same thing every single time. I actually think that comes more from not so much that it's a game system, but the fact that, and, I'm not a Jack Vance fan, but my understanding is that D&D magic is based on Vancian magic, which is this idea that, somebody correct me if I'm wrong if you know better, but like spells are almost creatures that you need to trap in your mind and keep them there. And once you cast the spell, you're releasing it from your mind, and therefore you cannot cast it again until you spend the time to study and rest and recapture the spell and hold it in your mind once more. And that's kind of why 5th edition has these discrete spells, is because that's the approach to magic that D&D has always sort of taken, which adapts, I think, very neatly and very nicely to a spell system. But the thing that I like to, along the lines of what you were saying, Dael, Shawn with Grim Hollow, and James, actually, along the lines of what you were all saying, is I like to remind players that spells in games that I run are not discrete things. You do not recognize spells automatically, even though you, the player, might recognize the spell, because to cast Fireball, you might point at a location and suddenly there is an explosion of flame. This dude vomits out a little ball of fire and then breathes on it and it bursts out into a massive, ball of flame. Or this dude shoots a laser from his eyes and it explodes, so the way everybody casts or creates the effect is different. They're all casting different spells, if you will. But they're, mechanically they have the same effect in game because we need to be able to apply a rule system to them. But one thing that I think about, and I wonder your takes on this, although I suspect I know your answer, is magic as art or magic as science? Because I think this approach very much takes the arcane arts, like I am painting with magic, I am plucking at the strings of reality, and I am changing what is possible as a form of self-expression, as opposed to magic as science, which is I know how to do these very specific things or create these effects from like alchemy, and maybe not literal alchemy, but maybe so. Sorry, James, what were you going to say?
I'm sorry. Dael is so excited. I can't help but let her go because I want to rewind and talk about something you blipped over. So
okay, sure.
Go forward. I'll come back to
I'm so sorry. I got excited because you said the word. You said alchemy, right? I feel like that for me is and I know other people are going to have different sweet spots, but that's the sweet spot for me because if you look at alchemy, I love that it's this snapshot in time where it's like the approach is so academic and scientific, but the beliefs are so artistic and capital R romantic. It's, it's this hope that, maybe we can turn copper into gold. Maybe if we find the right science, and I love thinking of magic that way, of being like science that isn't. So when I in my game have someone summon a familiar, I like to make it this whole little ritual where they have to collect some fur from a creature, some scales from another creature, and feathers from another creature, right? And that's to represent all the kingdoms of animals. And when I said that for the first time on the internet, everyone was like, that's not all the kingdoms of the animals, that's ridiculous. And I'm like, aha, but that's the idea, right? It's this sort of false categorization that represents the sort of early stages of science. That's what I really like to do. So it's both science and art. The false dichotomy has been shattered.
I was just reading about the four humors the other day because I was looking for an adjective, right? Because they're all adjectives. So I'm just writing
sanguine,
there. Sanguine, choleric, that sort of thing. But that's exactly the sort of like science that's wrong in a superstitious way, but they treat it like science, and it kind of works because they don't understand the world that well, but like we get to pretend that it works because it's magic, and like it works in ways that are poetic like this. That's like the root of really good fantasy to me.
Yeah. And what you can then do in your game is the science of a spell is what's written on the page it does. The art of the spell can be, well, I'm going to try to use this spell off brand. I want to do this tricky thing with it. Then you as the DM can say, well, you're a wizard, so give me an intelligence arcana check to make this work. If you roll high, it's going to work like you want it to. If you roll low, bad things are going to happen. Or if you're a charisma check, if you're a sorcerer, a wisdom religion check if you're a cleric, to make this happen in a way that's off-brand, but that does what you want it to do without going horrifically wrong.
I think that's a really fun system. I think you could mechanicalize that in a really neat little way.
Well, maybe we should. If
maybe
only we were
should.
game designers.
Wait a minute.
We had a platform to do something like this on.
Yeah, I mean, I will often let players change what spells do. I for kind of like balance reasons, and because there was I can't remember what the class is called, but I think it's in Tashes. It's a wizard subclass that can kind of play with spells, and like, I'm going to cast Fireball, but I want it to do necrotic damage, which I love the idea of being able to change what the spell does on the fly, and then I just imagine like a burst of black smog and everybody just rots inside of it. I love the idea of just unexpected effects. But I'll often say to players, look, because spells aren't specific things, you can change what the spell does, but you kind of have to stick with that change because this is how your character knows to cast that spell. So if you want to make Fireball do necrotic damage or lightning damage or whatever it is, totally. If that speaks to your player more, your character more, I should say, because you want to be a storm sorcerer, but you want the area of effect as opposed to the straight line, then let's make it you cast lightning ball or something along those lines, and it does that instead. So I like playing around with spells in that way?
I think you've stumbled upon an interesting sort of political clash that is represented within D&D's rules. And it is the difference between D&D's desire to be both a toolkit for your own fantasy story and its simultaneous and conflicting desire to be its own unique property with its own specific identity. Because when you make Fireball work a certain way, which is you create a marble-sized bead and it shoots to a point and then explodes, that is a D&D Fireball right there. And the more you specify the flavor of a spell like that, the closer you get to a fantasy property that could be like, Harry Potter or Warcraft, right? If any of you saw the Warcraft movie, which was fine, it was very cool how all of their different magics, their Fel, their Arcane, their Elemental, had a unique sort of look to them. And you could always tell who was doing what kind of magic, because Arcane was purple and angular and Fel was green and fiery and that sort of thing. But if you want to run D&D as like a toolkit for your own fantasy games, then your ideal spell would have almost no flavor description at all. It would be almost entirely mechanical. And then you could, your major image spell absolutely could be that sort of ships in the harbor disguised by the rain or manifested by the rain, because it's just an effect. It's just a thing that you can flavor however you want to.
That's the one thing that I ask at my tables constantly, except for can everybody roll for initiative, is what does that look like when you cast that spell? I'm the way that I like to play the game, and this is a personal thing to me, but is role play first and kind of weaving the story together first and the game second. And so when people say, all right, I want to walk into this room and I cast Fireball, I'll be like, well, can you describe to me what it looks like when you cast Fireball, and give players the opportunity to capture the flavor of their character beyond just the social parts of the game. Is it a D&D Fireball? Do you point and it explodes, or is it all your tattoos light up momentarily, and where you gaze with your red eyes, suddenly the room explodes? Is this something like, Dael, are you constantly asking this same question, or do you have players that kind of engage with that, or they prefer to just use the descriptions as given in the player's handbook?
I ask it, and it is fairly frequently resisted a little bit. I think I need to start, when people build characters and they say, oh, I'm going to be a spellcaster, I should just sort of make a side note and say, start thinking about what it looks like when you cast your spells, because I think that just... I run for new players a lot, or newer players, and I think that they just don't like to be caught off guard, not knowing. I do think, though, that once they embrace that thing of like, just say it, just say the thing that's in your head, because a lot of the time they are imagining something, but they don't want to say it in case it sounds silly. But once they embrace it, it's just great. It's like, yeah, it's fun. It's for fun. Please just have fun.
The thing I have to remind myself is to ask the martial classes to do the same thing. Describe your attacks. What are you aiming for? Which is hard in 5th edition, because a lot of the time they'll be like, I cut off his head, and it's like, well, you didn't.
Okay, well, not that, but
yeah, you can't quite do that.
Pull it back.
Yeah, for sure.
I think if you're a player who struggles with that, one thing to think about is to not think about the actual strike or the actual, like, what does the magic missile look like? I know a lot of people who are like, okay, what does your magic missile look like? And people will be like, they look like flaming lions' heads. And I think that's awesome. But a thing that goes back even more is, what is your style? What is your stance, right?
Sure.
The way in film that you can distinguish between two different sword fighters is like the way they stand, the way they hold their weapon, how they approach. Do they approach quickly? Do they approach slowly? Are their attacks really sudden, or are they choreographed and telegraphed beforehand?
Are they showing off and being flashy? Are they, being very careful and trained? That's a good point. I like that.
Are they playing Fate?
Yeah.
Are they playing Fate?
Yeah. Because the thing we're going for here isn't to, create a stronger picture in our head. It can be a little bit. We do like to use our unlimited special effects budget to create a very cool looking blockbuster in here. But really at the core of it all, what we want is, what does you doing this say about who your character is? What do they care about? How do they act? How do they comport themselves through the world? And how is that reflected in all aspects of what they do?
Yeah, the last wizard I had in a campaign I ran traveled back in time. And so all of his magic was technology. So his haste spell was like Red Bull. He would hand to the fighter. His magic missile was like Roman candle or lawn darts. And just all of these things that he would have a lighter and a can of aerosol spray to do firebolt. And so that was just one way of doing the same thing we've been talking about, but to a really creative degree.
Cool.
Yeah. I had an alchemist spellcaster who had enlarge reduce, and he cast it for the first time. He's like, I cast this on the barbarian, and what it looks like is I get a can and I fill it with something, and then I shake the can up and I throw it at the barbarian and it shatters, and then they have this horrific Hulk-like, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, like, blow up into being enlarged. I was like, that's disgusting. I love it. Let's keep going.
Yeah.
Shawn, I'm curious what your general experiences are in terms of, like, because you're playing a lot of Adventurers League, playing a lot of tables with players that, are either new to the game or they're not necessarily a pre-made group, and how they approach spellcasting at the table. Is it seen as typically just a mechanical thing? This is what happens to get through the adventure, because you're playing in a time limit as well, usually in that setting? Or do people like to really massage it out and get descriptive and play with the spellcasting?
Yeah, it really comes down to the player and the situation that you're in time-wise. If you only have an hour or 2 hours to get through an adventure and time is tight, you might give them as the DM, give the wizard or the sorcerer a prompt when they cast their first spell to see. If they just say, it explodes, you're like, okay, this is not a person that wants to delve into the theatrics of their character, and that's okay. I gave that prompt and it wasn't accepted, so we'll stick with the mechanics for this character. But some people appreciate that, knowing that there is a time limit. They might not have time to do it later, so give them their moment to shine at the table and tell their story.
Everyone's got a different style, and I think so many of the conflicts that we see at a D&D table or at any RPG table are just people's different styles conflicting. And either because someone can't recognize that these are different styles versus, there is one right way to play the game, or just that, like, there are simply not enough people in their area who are into D&D to, find a group whose style fits you better. Often people with disparate styles end up playing together. And, it comes down to a choice or an availability of, well, are you able to find a group whose style is really coherent? Or can you make the best of a group that has a really disparate style and find sort of the salad bowl, something for everything, something for everyone?
Yeah. And that's a big part of being a DM, is being aware of those differences in styles and knowing the techniques for letting this person do their style, letting that person do their style without them conflicting. And most people are aware enough that they will play their style without getting into some eye-rolling territory, overstepping their role to any degree, to be overly optimized, to be overly theatrical, to be overly grumpy, whatever that style is. Most gamers that I've tens of thousands of people I've gamed with, and I can count on maybe 10 fingers and 10 toes the people that took it too far in any direction.
Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You took the words right out of my mouth, literally, then, in terms of, it's the job of the GM to, like, be spinning both plates and make sure both players are getting theirs at the same time, or at least in balance at the table. Super quick, we did get an email this week. If you want to have a conversation with us, you can email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. This comes from Mara, and this is I thought it was appropriate. It's a magical question. It's a very mechanical question. Mara says, "Hi friends, really enjoying the podcast. Quick question. What that's come up in their game lately, how do you rule piercing, slashing, or bludgeoning damage that comes specifically from a spell? Is that damage magical because it comes from a spell for the purposes of resistances, immunities, etc.? Settle a bet for me." And I don't think that I got caught off guard by this as well once, because I definitely have thoughts that this goes a certain way. But I'm curious to hear, Shawn, how do you rule this? Or has this ever occurred to you that it could go one way or the other?
Absolutely. And I always say yes. If it's coming from a spell, it is magical. And generally I'm ruling that way because it's going to speed the game up.
Okay. Fair.
And instead of getting bogged down in something that drags the game on to no one's joy, then let's just make it magical since it's coming from a spell, and we'll get through this combat a little bit quicker.
Are you more often playing in convention style settings where time is a pressure for you?
For the first 10 years, no. For the second 10 years I played, yes. And for the last 10 years, it's been a mix.
Right.
Pretty even mix.
The eras of Shawn Merwin's
exactly. You could cut me open and count my rings.
No, I don't want to. Okay. I prefer you as
only when you're done, Shawn.
It's got to be magical slashing damage, though.
This is a really interesting question, because when I think about the spell Cloud of Daggers, right? That's the spell that comes to mind. That's the spell that deals slashing damage. There aren't a lot of them.
No.
I think, yes, I would 1,000% rule that. That's magical slashing damage that comes from a spell. But if you were to, say, cast Stone Shape or something and use it to earthbend a stone spike that juts out of the ground, I'd be like, well, I don't know. That feels different somehow. It gets me into the territory of what actually causes, what is the stuff that the spell manifested and what is left over, right? Like if you cast Fireball, I don't think there's any question that the explosion of fire that deals its initial damage is magical fire damage. I mean, it doesn't, there's no distinction in the game term, so it doesn't matter, but it's magical. But say the fire that catches on every flammable thing in the room, is that still a magical effect? I don't think so. The conjuring of the magic was the magical thing. Everything else is just nature and physics running its course. So when you get right down to it, I think I'll leave questions like that for the philosophers and say that yes, your spell deals magical bludgeoning, piercing, slashing damage if you cast it.
Okay. Speaking of philosophers, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just. I guess the last thing I was thinking came to me right this moment is, if the spell causes something to happen instantaneously, that instantaneous thing is 100% magical. But if it causes something to linger, the lingering effect is not. Like if you stone shaped a spike of earth, a spike of rock, and it pierced someone, I would call that piercing magical. But if that stalagmite you've made hangs around for another hour and you circle back into the room and someone gets hurled onto it, then I think that's normal piercing damage caused by something in the environment.
Okay. Yeah. I laugh because it's a very particular delineation.
Yeah.
It's like, at what point does it stop being magical?
Yeah, it's I before E except after C, except as in A, as in reindeer and sleigh. It just keeps getting bigger every time.
It's alchemy, baby.
Yeah, it's alchemy.
Dael, what do you think?
I don't know. I think I'm going to plant myself firmly on the fence here because I my gut instinct is to go on the record and say, yes, absolutely magical. But I just know that people will say, what about? And I'll say, oh, yeah, that. And then they'll go, okay, but what about also this? And I'll go, okay, yes, that too. Another exception, another. And we're just going to end up. I mean, it's true, though, that there aren't really ultimately that many spells that list bludgeoning, piercing, slashing as a damage type, right? So maybe that is the key. Maybe it's like, if the spell says it, then yeah, that is magical. But if the spell doesn't specifically state that it causes bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage, then suddenly... I'm thinking about this in terms as well of my injury table, which I based entirely around damage types, and I'm trying to see, is this suddenly a problem?
Where does it fit? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
If you would an official answer on February 14th, 2018 via Twitter. One of the heads of the D&D team at that time said, yes, piercing, bludgeoning, or slashing damage from spells is magical damage.
There we go.
And
we're absolved. It's on them now.
I got caught off guard by this by a player because it hadn't even occurred to me that it would be magical, because slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning are the only damage types that really have this delineation, right, between between magical damage and non-magical damage, because they're the only damage types that really need it in terms of fighting wraiths and demons and creatures that are resistant to different types of damage, werewolves, and wraiths, incorporeal undead tend to be resistant to elemental damage, but it's weird to me that a wraith would get caught up in spike growth or cloud of daggers, but can shrug off, a magical fireball or a magical firebolt. And I think for me, thematically, it's kind of what you were saying, James, is like, for me, the magic is summoning the cloud of daggers and making the daggers swirl in the air, but the daggers themselves are not, magical. It's kind of like you've conjured them out of an ethereal portal. But the bigger reason that I go for this, and I think that damage resistances and immunities, I know they're a huge topic of debate within the system, within the game. Are they fun to use? Are they not fun to use? Are they relevant? I feel like allowing spells that do piercing, bludgeoning, slashing damage to do that magically kind of creates any tool for any situation kind of dichotomy or problem, rather than a specific tool required for a specific situation. No, your spike growth will not trap a wraith or damage a wraith, but you've got other spells in your toolkit to be able to deal with this specific monster. Swarm of kobolds, spike growth them up,
I think I've just changed my mind as you were talking, because I'm now thinking about as well this sort of major injuries table that I made that was split by damage type. Now that I'm thinking about it, while I was doing that and looking, I read a lot of medical journals and I saw some harrowing images, but in amongst that, it came to the point where I was like, okay, the only magic types that are sort of inherently not physical are psychic, radiant, force, kind of, depending on how you read the description of it, and necrotic maybe, but there are real world things that cause necrosis. It's just that they're typically poisonous, so there's a weird thing there. But now maybe I'm on the complete opposite end of it. Maybe I'm like, no, none of the magical effects are magical damage, except those 3, 4.
Because the other thing is, I like to rule with weapons. I don't call it magical weapon damage. I call it silvered. Even if the weapon isn't specifically silvered, I say this weapon counts as doing like silver damage, because that differentiates it entirely from bludgeoning, slashing, piercing. And if it, if it's not relevant whether it's silvered or not, then whatever the weapon happens to be, if it's a longsword, it does slashing silvered damage. If it's, whatever. And that kind of helps avoid contradictions or conundrums, or does this weapon harm this creature or does it not? And it also means that the weapon doesn't, like, magical weapons don't all work against golems, which creates an even bigger kind of like, not every tool is going to fit every situation, but that's kind of the point. You've got to, you're going to specialize in different areas. You can't cover every base, but there's 5 of you, so hopefully one of you can. Anyway, damage immunities and resistances, I think, are a massive topic that we should save for a future episode, because that about does us for time for today. If you want to keep the conversation going, our Twitter handles are just below our names here, or you can email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com, which Mara did. Send us a question, give us something to debate, to discuss among ourselves, or leave a comment down below if you're watching this on YouTube. Otherwise, I've been Ben Byrne, here with Dael Kingsmill, James Hake, Shawn Merwin. We will see you guys next week.